The summer vacation began as it usually did with a trip to the family house. It was a place where my brother Stephen, his son Jacob, and I often spent our summer holidays. The old house, standing on the edge of the forest in a remote area, hadn't seen any repairs in years. The terraces were overgrown, the paint on the doors was peeling, and the garden had become a neglected kingdom of weeds. But for us, it was more about tradition than a genuine desire for solitude. Stephen, as always, saw it as an opportunity to dive into work. He was already planning to renovate the house to start a major project, which perfectly fit into his current plans. I was hoping for something different. I dreamed that in this seclusion, I would be able to reconnect with my brother, forget the hustle and bustle of city life, and finally talk to him about things we had been putting off for a long time. But, as always, Stephen was absorbed in his work. Jacob, young and full of enthusiasm, tried to cheer us both up. His cheerful talks, stories about his student days, even the smallest jokes, were as lively as his energy. But at that moment, what attracted me the most wasn't his chatter, but the emptiness I felt next to Stephen. Far from home, in its cold, empty walls, I thought about how much my brother and I needed to say to each other, yet something always held us back. I longed for a conversation, but all I received was silence and a look that told me work was more important. And so, I was left alone with Jacob. Not simply because Stephen was busy, but because I felt that with him, I could talk about things I wasn't ready to discuss with my own brother. Jacob was full of life and curiosity about everything. He couldn't help but share his impressions of university, about how everything was changing, how people were changing. It was easy with him, and I felt my attention shift to him. I needed at least a little closeness, something that was missing in my relationship with Stephen. But as with any attempt to escape from reality, to something simpler and warmer, I didn't know what I was really looking for in this company. When we finally arrived, the house greeted us not as a cozy refuge, but as a monument to a time that had passed irretrievably. Its appearance was deceptive. It seemed as though it could still come to life if someone gave it enough attention. But the peeling paint, the cracked threshold, and the neglected garden only emphasized its gloomy history. In that moment, I didn't feel a connection to this place as much as its helplessness. It seemed the house had long since surrendered to the mercy of time, remaining in the shadow of passing years. Without wasting any time, Stephen got to work. He was sure that the renovation was just what he needed to distract himself from his daily routine, and at least for a while, feel in control of the situation. He immediately opened the blueprints and dug into his tool bag, preparing for the great changes ahead. I remained on the sidelines, watching without much desire to get involved. There was no urgency in his actions, and I knew that he wasn't so much concerned about the house as he was about the chance to lose himself in an endless list of tasks. As for Jacob, he looked completely different. He was interested in everything: the house, the garden, the old walls that seemed to breathe new life along with him. He laughed as he proposed ideas to improve the garden, got excited about how he would furnish the rooms as if this wasn't just a house, but something much more. His enthusiasm was contagious. There was a lightness in his words, and his gaze revealed a genuine interest in everything that was happening around us. Jacob constantly tried to talk, start conversations, share his thoughts, filling the silence around us with his vibrant presence. But it was hard for me to embrace this atmosphere, because all I saw was emptiness. There was none of what I was looking for. Instead of the depth of communication with my brother, I only felt distance. His focus was on the project, and I couldn't help but feel like an outsider. Everything was as usual. Stephen was lost in his work, and I remained in the shadows, hoping that at least Jacob could understand me. But despite his attention and care, it was hard to shake the feeling that I still remained on the sidelines. In the evening, when Stephen went to the nearby town for supplies, I found myself alone with Jacob. We were having dinner on the old terrace, which no one had cared for in years. The table was covered in dust and a light layer of dirt, but Jacob, as always, tried to make this moment something special. He told me how he had recently taken a difficult exam, joking about how he was ready for easier, less intellectual tasks, like working for the summer with his uncle. I listened to him, smiling faintly, but I felt something subtle beginning to pull me toward him. "So, what do you think of the house?" he asked, shifting the conversation to a more familiar topic. I shrugged, unsure of what to say. This house seemed foreign to me, too far removed from everything I considered comfort, yet there was something captivating in its history. It, it's old. I paused, searching for the right words. It's like it's lived through many years but hasn't quite stayed alive. Jacob nodded quietly. It's like a person who's worn a mask for too long. Once there was a spark in its eyes, but now everything is clouded over. He looked at me again, his gaze more serious than usual, and I felt how the lightness of our conversation began to fade, leaving behind something deeper. The silence between us grew. I couldn't quite understand what was bothering me, but I felt that our talks had stopped being superficial. He was no longer just entertaining me with stories. Something hidden in his words made me think. We were silent, but the silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was quiet, yet at the same time full of meaning, as if in its space, important words could be heard. I caught myself observing him. How he unfolded his napkin, how he thoughtfully looked at me and then at the plate, as if asking what lay behind each of my gestures. It was a strange feeling. Not that he was analyzing me, but he was certainly noticing that I wasn't quite there. Something had changed in his behavior, but I couldn't pinpoint what exactly. It was like an elusive thread stretching between us, not yet a clear bridge, but already making it impossible to ignore the person sitting next to me. One day, when Jacob and I were cleaning out the basement, something in the air felt completely different. The basement was filled with old junk. Boxes of books, tarnished vases, forgotten toys that once seemed valuable. We were pulling them out from the corners, dusting them off, and stacking them in piles, trying to bring at least part of the space into order. I was absorbed in the task when I stumbled upon a box that turned out to be much heavier than I had expected. I tried to lift it with one hand, but the box was bulky and unbearably heavy. It nearly slipped from my grip, and in that moment, I felt it beginning to fall. In a panic, I didn't react in time. And suddenly, as if by magic, Jacob was right there. He caught the box, preventing it from hitting the floor, and in that motion, there was not just agility, but also certainty. "Are you okay?" His voice sounded unexpectedly close, and I felt his breath lightly brush my ear. He was standing so close, and for a moment I froze. I could have said that this moment was ordinary, but there was something in the way he looked at me, the way his hand effortlessly held the heavy box, that made me feel as though the whole world in that instant had narrowed down to those few seconds. I let go of the box, allowing him to take it from me. His hand still held it, and my fingers briefly touched his wrist as I pulled away. There were no words, nothing that could explain what exactly was happening in that moment. But it seemed to me that there was something more in his gaze than just offering help. We both froze, almost motionless, as though instinctively understanding that this moment was important. Then he gave a slight smile, as if answering my silent questions, and we went back to work. But it wasn't the same as before. We both knew that something had changed. I couldn't understand why this event, seemingly just an accident, left such a mark. My thoughts were tangled, and inside me grew a feeling that I couldn't immediately decipher. The sense of his closeness lingered like a shadow, remaining even after everything had returned to its usual course. Jacob continued to help me with household chores as if it had become his invisible duty. Every morning, when I was cleaning, he would unexpectedly appear with a cup of coffee in his hands, silently offering it to me with a light smile, as if it were the most natural gesture in the world. His little acts, carefully wiping the dust from the shelves, offering to help with heavy boxes, even the compliments he casually threw my way. All of it was starting to form something larger. It felt strange how quickly his attention became important to me. When he said, "You look especially beautiful today," even if it was said casually, my thoughts would instantly scatter. I would feel embarrassed, but I couldn't help but wonder why his words left a mark. Why I wanted to hear them over and over again. These weren't just compliments. It was the ease with which he approached everything, his attention that I hadn't noticed before but now couldn't ignore. I tried to stay focused on the task at hand, on the household chores, but his presence became inevitable. Every time he appeared in the room, I felt something that I couldn't explain in words. I noticed how he often caught my gaze, as if looking for an answer to his unspoken question. His laughter, even in the most mundane situations, was something alive and real, and I suddenly realized that this was exactly what I had been missing. The liveliness, the simplicity of communication that I hadn't experienced in so long. One evening, when we were cooking dinner together, I felt his hand brush against mine as he handed me the knife. It was such an insignificant gesture that no one else might have noticed it. But for me, it became something important. His hand lingered next to mine for a few seconds, and I felt the warmth of his touch, even though it was entirely accidental. I tried not to pay attention to it, but inside, everything seemed to whirl, as if this moment had become the key that unlocked a door to the unknown. Something was changing. I could feel it, but I couldn't quite understand how it was happening. Jacob was becoming more and more noticeable, and his little gestures were no longer just politeness. They began to sound like hints, like riddles that I wanted to solve. And although I tried to remain detached, I was becoming increasingly aware that this attention, these moments with him, were no longer just part of the usual routine. One day, while walking through the house, I accidentally peeked into Jacob's room. He was sitting in his chair, a light smile on his face, talking to a girl. I froze in place at the door, not expecting to see such a thing. Seeing her, I felt something inside me tighten. It was an unexpected scene. They both seemed relaxed, talking about something light and casual, their laughter genuine. I felt the air around me grow heavier and my mind clouded. I didn't know what to do. I shouldn't have interrupted them, but I couldn't just leave. I stood still, staring into their world, which was completely unfamiliar to me, yet it still made me feel uncomfortable. Confusion and pain mixed with irritation. I had no right to intervene. I couldn't allow myself to feel jealousy or sadness, but it was more than just awkwardness. It was a discovery I hadn't been seeking, but it had arrived. I quickly turned around and hurried to leave. It was so strange and unexpected that I didn't immediately understand what had shaken me so much. When I reached another part of the house, my legs felt weak, and I didn't even know how to move forward. I tried to calm myself, but my heart was beating too fast, and my thoughts were tangled. Now I understood. The feelings I had been trying to hide were much more complicated than I had thought. I had believed I could simply enjoy Jacob's attention, but what I had seen made me realize that what I felt was much deeper. I couldn't stop thinking about what had been happening between us. The glances, his words that had seemed so innocent, but now carried an entirely different meaning. I returned to my room, but it no longer felt like a place where I could find peace. Everything was different now. My mind was in chaos, and there was nothing that could soothe me. I knew that this discovery would forever change my relationship with Jacob, but I still couldn't shake the feeling that I could never be the same again. With each passing day, I increasingly avoided Jacob, despite his constant kindness and eagerness to help. I became overly absorbed in my thoughts, as if I was trying to block out everything that was happening around me. I couldn't find anything to distract myself. Every morning when I woke up, the thoughts of what had happened between us wouldn't leave me. I thought about what I had seen, how he had sat with the girl, and how his attention toward me had become much more noticeable. It seemed that every glance he gave me was filled with hints. Every word began to sound different. We continued talking about simple things, but I could no longer take his words the way I had before. With each new moment when he appeared nearby, it felt like I was losing control over my feelings. His presence became like a mirror, where I saw not only myself, but also the hidden emotions I had been trying to ignore. I tried to remain composed, but inside, waves of doubt raged. I couldn't understand what exactly was scaring me. Perhaps it was the realization that I couldn't make things go back to how they were. But, on the other hand, I didn't know what to do with what I was now feeling. Everything had become so complicated. Jacob continued doing the same little things, smiling, helping, but his silent glances, his attention, made me reflect. He was there, and I knew I was hiding from him what I didn't want to admit. But even despite all my attempts to avoid him, I felt that it was only making everything more intense. It seemed as though my feelings were no longer under control. We stayed in the same room, pretending that nothing had changed, but inside me, everything was shifting. The silence between us had grown heavy, and I knew I couldn't hide my emotions any longer. Every word I spoke felt forced, and when he entered the room again, I realized I could no longer keep my distance. Everything I had tried to push away seemed to have overtaken me, and there was no turning back. One evening, it was just like any other, but this time, I felt that I could no longer keep hiding my emotions. Stephen had left again, and I was alone with Jacob. Everything I had been trying to avoid now became unbearably obvious. We sat in the living room, silently, as always. I could feel his presence next to me, even though he was trying not to be intrusive, but it was enough to keep me from focusing on anything else. We sat and watched the fire in the fireplace, softly smoldering, creating a cozy atmosphere. But between us, there was a chasm I couldn't cross. He sat across from me, his gaze occasionally sliding toward me, but I avoided meeting his eyes. I knew that everything happening between us couldn't simply be ignored, but I couldn't find the strength to admit it. I tried to distract myself, thinking about Stephen, who would be back soon, about how to make the evening more ordinary. But in my mind, it all came back to one thing. I couldn't avoid what was pulling me toward Jacob any longer. And then, when I lifted my eyes again, our gazes met. There were no words, no sounds. In that moment, the world around us disappeared, and I realized I could no longer step back. He didn't look away, didn't say anything, but I could see that he felt the same. Without any warning, almost instinctively, I stood up. He did too. We kissed. In the morning, I woke up with the sense that the world around me had changed. Everything seemed familiar, but inside me there was something new, something unknown. The lightness in my chest made it hard to focus on the usual tasks, and the thoughts of what had happened wouldn't let me rest. The kiss from yesterday still resonated in my memory, like a sound, the echoes of which linger long after the silence. He was nearby, and it was more than just the meeting of two people. It was the acknowledgement that between us there was something that could not be hidden, something that shouldn't be ignored. But when the kiss ended, the world returned to its usual place, even though, for me, everything had changed. I got up trying to act as usual, but I felt how this familiar routine suddenly became foreign. Stephen had returned, and I couldn't look him in the eyes. His presence next to Jacob now felt even heavier than before. We didn't talk about it, didn't discuss what had happened, but I knew that between Jacob and me now was something that couldn't be erased. It was in every glance, every silent pause, in how we started avoiding each other. Jacob also avoided me, but I could feel that now there was another kind of distance between us. We couldn't go back to what had been before. With each passing day, with each new moment we spent together, it became harder to pretend that nothing had changed. I could feel his gaze on me, even if he didn't say a word. And I could no longer pretend that this secret between us would disappear, even if we both tried to ignore it. Stephen came home, noticing nothing unusual. He was always focused on his work, and I tried not to show what was happening inside me. We talked about everyday things, exchanged trivial phrases, but I felt that none of these words were real. It was hard for me to look him in the eyes because I knew. Our home, our relationship, everything that once felt stable had truly changed. When I met Jacob, he too avoided my gaze. We talked, but every conversation was mundane and insignificant. We pretended that nothing had happened, but between us, in every silence, there lingered a heaviness that couldn't be forgotten. We both knew that the kiss between us had changed everything. I tried to behave as I had before. I worked in the garden, helped Stephen, arranged dinners, but everything I did felt foreign. I couldn't shake the thought that, despite this daily routine, something unknown and irreversible had developed between Jacob and me. This feeling became a part of my world, and I couldn't ignore it. His presence nearby was no longer the same, but neither could I be the same. Time passed, and I knew that Jacob and I would try to forget, ignore, hide our feelings, but I also understood that it wouldn't go away. The secret we both shared was becoming more palpable with each passing day. We tried to act as usual, but something intangible hung in the air. Our glances, even the casual ones, had become significant, and the silence between Jacob and me weighed heavily on both of us. He continued his routine, helping around the house, but his presence was like an invisible line, increasingly crossing the boundary between us, disrupting our usual rhythm. I tried to control my feelings, convincing myself that none of this mattered, that it was just a moment, perhaps not worth giving so much weight. But every day I felt the secret becoming more and more apparent. Jacob and I could no longer communicate as we once had. His silent glances, his attempts to make conversation about neutral things, as if avoiding what had happened, became difficult for both of us. We both knew everything had changed, but we couldn't find a way to talk about it openly. Stephen, as always, was absorbed in his projects and didn't notice what was happening around him. His work on the house became his escape from all the other questions. He was in his element, unaware of the changes in the relationship between me and his son. Sometimes I felt as though I were living on two different planets. One was the home where I continued to exist with Stephen, and the other was the world I shared with Jacob, even though our words never touched on what really troubled us. I knew that, despite everything happening, the secret Jacob and I shared would never go away. It would stay with us. Even if we tried to hide it, ignore it, it would remain, quietly and inevitably affecting every word, every glance, every movement. One evening, when everyone was silent and Jacob and I, holding our breath, both understood that everything was no longer as it had been before, I realized something important. The secret we carried inside had now become part of us. And while it was a heavy burden, we both knew we couldn't return things to the way they were. We couldn't go back to the moment when everything was simple and clear, because that moment was gone. We had become different people, and this secret, like an invisible thread, connected us, despite all our attempts to avoid it. I closed my eyes, and in that moment, I understood. This was inevitable. Several weeks had passed since everything changed. Jacob and I continued living under the same roof, but something invisible, elusive, and heavy hung between us. We both knew that we couldn't go back to what we had been before the kiss. The secret we now held was felt not only in our words and glances, but also in the silences that had become burdensome and increasingly charged. I found myself asking more and more how long we could continue living in parallel worlds. Stephen didn't notice what was happening between us. His focus remained on his work, and at one point it even seemed like he was avoiding any attempts to look beyond his project world. We still maintained superficial conversations, just as we always had, but I understood that everything had changed. Our relationship had become cold, veiled by invisible walls, and with Jacob it became even more complicated. We both tried to act as if nothing had happened, but our silences grew long and tense. I could no longer ignore my feelings, but I didn't know how to deal with them. We avoided open conversations, fearing that if we spoke about what had happened, it would mark the end for both of us. And at some point, I realized that perhaps that was exactly what needed to happen. To decide what we would do with this, rather than continuing to live in the shadow of silence. One evening, when Jacob and I were alone, I couldn't hold back the question that had been tormenting me. We were sitting on the terrace, our heads tilted under the soft evening light, and I finally said, "Jacob, what now between us? I can't live in this silence anymore. I can't hide that everything has changed. We can't pretend that everything is still the same." He didn't answer right away, as if trying to understand what I meant. Then his gaze became more determined. He stood up and walked toward me. The pause between us was heavy, but in that moment I realized that I couldn't stay in this uncertain space anymore. "I know," he said, his voice quiet but steady. "I feel it too. I know we can't go back. But I don't want to lose us. I don't know what comes next, but I'm ready to move forward. Maybe we just need to start over and figure out what this means for us." His words weren't a promise, but a revelation. It wasn't the answer I expected, but it was honest, and in that moment, I understood that our path together wasn't over. The secret we carried was still a part of us, but it no longer had to be an obstacle. Instead of avoiding it, we could start finding our way, not knowing where it would lead us. So, despite all the complexity and uncertainty, I felt that a new path lay ahead of us, a path we had to walk together. And though it would be difficult, and though it would bring new questions and doubts, I knew one thing. We wouldn't hide anymore. We chose to move forward, despite the secrets that remained between us. Several weeks had passed since the evening when Jacob and I finally talked about what had been hanging between us for so long. After that candid conversation, it was as if a door had opened between us, one we had long been afraid to open. We no longer tried to hide behind masks of normalcy. There were silences, awkward moments when our gazes lingered a little longer than usual. But now, there was a conversation between us. And that mattered more than anything. Stephen hadn't noticed any changes. He continued to work focused on the house renovation, and maybe that was for the best. Jacob and I began to find ways to rebuild our shared world, step by step, no longer feeling strange around each other. I no longer felt that heavy weight in my chest when I thought about what had happened, but one important question remained unresolved. What now, between us? The secret we kept still remained, but now it was a part of us, not a barrier dividing our lives. We no longer avoided each other, but we also didn't try to rush into finding an answer to what was between us. It felt like a slow, conscious entry into a new world, one where everything still seemed undefined but inevitable. I didn't know where this would lead, but I felt that, despite all the challenges, we had to move forward. One day, sitting in the garden among the weathered trees, Jacob and I spoke about what the future might hold. We talked about how we now saw the world, how perhaps our views and relationships had changed. But there was something soothing in how we sat quietly, sharing that moment without even trying to figure out the future. Have you ever thought that maybe it would be easier to just leave everything as it is? Jacob asked, not taking his eyes off the ground where his fingers traced invisible lines. I looked at him, and in his eyes I saw the same doubts, the same questions that tormented me. And in that moment, I realized that this path, whatever it might be, was now our path. We had chosen to be together despite everything, despite the complexity our secret brought. We couldn't erase the past, but we could keep moving forward, together. No, I finally said. I think we have to move forward. Otherwise, we'll stay stuck, just drifting along, not making any decisions. And I don't want that. And despite all the uncertainty and fear, I felt something inside me fall into place. There were no clear answers, no exact path. But there was one important realization. Despite all the obstacles, despite all the secrets, we wouldn't back down. We chose to walk this path. And that was our decision. As we stood up and walked toward the house, I understood that this step marked the beginning of a new journey. It might not be perfect. It might be full of uncertainty, but it was a path that we could only walk together. New days brought a new reality. We didn't try to build perfect relationships, and perhaps that was the most important thing. With each passing day, Jacob and I became a little more open, but we remained cautious because we knew that every step, every word, could once again lead us back to something that had been so difficult to endure. We didn't build illusions, but we didn't shy away from trying to be honest with each other. One evening, sitting by the fire, I felt how hard it was to remain in this state of uncertainty. We avoided speaking directly, but something told me that we both knew it was time to take the next step. We sat together, listening to the crackling of the fire, and I felt a growing resolve within me. Jacob, I said, and my voice suddenly became firm. He turned toward me, and I noticed a slight anxiety flicker in his eyes. We both knew that this moment would be important. I can't live like this anymore. We can't keep hiding from ourselves. I can't keep living in silence, just hoping everything will sort itself out. We need to decide what we're doing next. You're right, he said. I need to understand what this means for us. I don't want to run away from this responsibility, but I don't want to just stay in the shadow of what's been. We can get through this, but we need to know for sure that we're both ready for it. There were no promises, no clear plans for the future. But one thing was clear. We had decided we wouldn't hide from each other anymore. We weren't going to continue living in the shadow of silence. We were ready to make difficult decisions, fully aware that the future would be unpredictable, but at least it would be ours. We both felt that this step was important, a step into a new beginning, one where there was no room for fear or doubt,